Alpha Sigma!
Huh?
𝒮𝔲𝔢𝔯𝔮𝔲𝔢𝔯𝒮𝔮𝔲𝔢𝔮𝔲!
Wait a minute!
The Science Show!
Piano! What idea was this?
Science isn't about why, it's about why not.
Ours is a cycle of hatred.
They would brand us unworthy.
Alliances forged and broken.
Usurpers.
We have paid the price for sharing this world.
And everything that's in it.
And we have forgotten what makes us strong.
We have our revenge.
A tavern. I hereby declare it the property of Queen Carillion the First. Oh, the tavern's gone.
Oh, another tavern. We need another tavern.
It's all fallen down. Helmgart's drunk.
I'm a steam tank.
The party knife, Bigsy.
Welcome.
Foolish Lumberfoot Mayflies. If I were a door, I'd be the best door, obviously. But where would I be?
What's up, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Handmaiden Hero Spotlight Guide. It's here, it's happening, it's the class king of clutches, or queen I guess. Regardless, the single most mobile hero in the entire game, and as it so happens, one of my absolute favorites and most played heroes. Now, apologies for the delay guys, but I've been feeling sort of besides myself the past few days. I don't know if I've been sick or whatever, but I basically haven't gotten jack shit done for 4 days straight, so that's why there has been a slight delay, so apologies. But anyways, with that said, let's get started. Now, the first thing you need to know about playing the Handmaiden, which will likely surprise most players, is that in any context where you are playing on the official realm with the team, Handmaiden is first and foremost a support class. Yes, you heard me right, a support class. But don't let that discourage you, cause she is so much more than just a support class. But it's hard to overstate enough that your first, second and third priority is to keep you and your team alive. However, when that does fail for whatever reason, you just so happen to be on the single most mobile hero in the entire game, and by far the best case scenario for clutching the shit out of any situation. And we'll get to that in more detail later in the guide. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start out by looking at some of her key metrics. In a returning segment and part 2, key metrics and passive abilities explained. Now, one could easily make the claim that the Handmaiden has the single best set of passive abilities in the game, or at the very least, she has the single best passive ability in the game, but we'll get to that momentarily. But first, let's start off by looking at some of her metrics. Now, the Handmaiden lies in the middle with a base HP pool of 125, which can be increased to 150 with 20% health on the necklace. And with a career ability cooldown of just 20 seconds, she has the single lowest cooldown of any career ability currently in the game. Which is probably also why she's on the lowest end of the spectrum when it comes to regenerating her career ability, based on enemy minions hit at 0.25 seconds or a quarter of a second. She does however remain on the high end of the spectrum when it comes to the amount you refresh based on damage taken, which in her case is especially crucial to be aware of, since with a cooldown of only 20 seconds and half a second per damage taken regenerated, that means with only 40 damage taken, you'll refresh your entire career ability, which on the highest game difficulties essentially boils down to the fact that even getting hit by a single trash minion is in fact sufficient to regenerate your entire career ability, which is an absolute lifesaver when you're trying to keep your head above water. This means you almost always have a last second escape route even when all seems lost and you're completely surrounded, and that's just one of a number of reasons why you never give up when you're playing on the Handmaiden. But let's move on to her passive abilities, cause as I mentioned earlier, they're pretty OP. First up, we have the Dance of Seasons, which grants the Handmaiden a plus 15% additively stacking bonus to her dodge distance, which is very nice. Up next, we have 𝒮𝔤𝔤𝔢𝔯𝔞𝔤𝔢𝔮𝔲𝔞𝔮𝔬𝔐, which cuts the time it takes to revive a friendly player in half, as well as granting them a plus 20 health bonus upon being revived. Up next, we got Renewal, which is the single most OP broken passive ability in the entire game. It grants a plus 100% stamina regeneration aura that can potentially affect your entire team, and it's an absolute lifesaver, cutting the window in half between the consumption of stamina and the regeneration of stamina. And this passive is so good that even if it only applied to the Handmaiden herself, it would still be one of the best passive abilities in the entire game. And finishing up the list, we have an unlisted passive ability granting the Handmaiden a plus 1 stamina buff. And so all in all, she has extra mobility, extra defense for both her and her team, and lastly the ability to quickly and safely rescue her teammates. Which brings us to the execution of an amazing transition.
Nice.
Oh, and of course, part 3, a quick review on her talents. Now, this part is going to differ slightly from previous videos, since pretty much all of her talents work exactly as advertised, and will instead focus on the individual value and viability of each talent for each level, in order to set you up nicely for the part that's all about builds. Now, first things first, we got Spirit Echo, which is what you're gonna be using most of the time for most builds, since it's the most consistent of the 3, assuming you have decent cleave, whereas Martial Blessing shines better with single target weapons with high armor damage. And as for Eternal Blossom, that is kinda off meta, although I do have a single build included using this talent. Moving on, we got Focused Spirit, which used to be the go-to talent before the Big Balance beta, and although it's still super viable, it does occupy a niche in the current meta. And as for Oak Stance, you can pretty much just forget all about this talent, since the single only use it has is a super niche dual swords build that ignores the fact that it has no armor damage and instead relies on critical hits to do armor damage. Which brings us to Asrai Alacrity, which is currently the talent you're gonna be selecting for 9 out of 10 builds, since there's only a 5% power difference for melee attacks as well as the added attack speed on top. Not to mention it's a lot more forgiving for slightly less mechanically skilled players. And moving on to level 15, you're gonna be using enhanced power most of the time in order to hit certain significant ranged breakpoints. However, you can also use both mainstay and smiter depending on your weapon. It's a similar scenario to the difference between Spirit Echo and Martial Blessing, in that if you have a single target weapon, you're gonna be using smiter, and if you have a weapon with good cleave, you're gonna be using mainstay. Now moving on to level 20 and level 25, we have the 2 talents you can play around with the most. What I mean by that is that the first 3 and the last talent are fairly fixed in every single build I'm going to suggest, whereas the level 20 and 25 talents can be modified depending on your playstyle and preferences. Now, in my own personal opinion, and this is certainly an opinion, Wraithwalk is by far the best level 20 talent, adding a whole extra dimension of freedom to the use of your career ability, since you no longer have to worry about getting stuck in the middle of a crowd. And just in case it wasn't clear enough, that's my opinion and not a fact. Now, as for Dance of Blades, it sounds great on paper, but in practice it's actually not very good, and a much better choice for an aggressive talent would be Willow Stance, which is certainly an amazing talent since you're almost always capable of keeping up all 3 stacks for an extra 15% attack speed. So really what this comes down to is survivability versus melee aggression, but I would certainly always pick either of these 2 talents over Dance of Blades. Moving on, we got Quiver of Plenty, which is the aggressive choice in the level 25 talent section, allowing you to keep up your DPS by using your longbow, which, as we'll get to momentarily, can in fact be your primary source of DPS. Moving on, we got Birch Stance, which is the defensive selection for the level 25 talent, and is far better than the 3rd talent, Heart of Oak, which is another case of you can just forget all about this talent because you're essentially never going to be using it. And lastly, for the level 30 talent, we have Power from Pain, which I have used in a single build, but it most certainly constitutes a niche in the current meta, and you're not gonna be picking this talent very often, and the exact same thing can be said for the talent Blade Dancer, which again isn't necessarily terrible, terrible, but either of these talents are simply overshadowed by Gift of Ladriel, which is simply absolutely fucking amazing, both for aggression and for survival, both for staying alive and for keeping your team alive. It allows you to reposition every time you use your ultimate, it allows you time to evade both assassins and stranglers, it guarantees a position of safety when you're resurrecting your teammates, and it essentially gives you that extra degree of freedom and safety that allow you to make those bold plays and play super aggressively. And you can even use your ultimate, equip your longbow, aim, take a shot, kill the special, re-equip your melee weapon and block in time, albeit that does require a bit of practice. And speaking of which, let's move on to part 4, which just happens to be all about the longbow. Yeah, it wasn't perfect. Cannot live with the shame of not being perfect. But thankfully it still looks pretty dope with slow motion. Even with my horrible aim, you still get the point. Which was... oh yeah, the longbow is fucking amazing. Now, the first thing you need to know about the longbow is that even on Cataclysm difficulty, assuming 650 power, you can already one-shot headshot every special minion in the game, as well as certain elites like monks, berserkers, and storm vermins. What the? What the fuck? There we go, that's better. Now, as for legend difficulty, again assuming 650 power and no power versus properties or other talents that affect your range damage, it's a fairly similar story to that of Cataclysm. However, in this case, you can not only one-shot headshot and two-shot body shot every special in the game, but also one-shot headshot every elite with the noticeable exception of a Chaos Warrior. But now that we know exactly what a longbow can do on its own, let's move on to the crucial part of the puzzle known as breakpoints. Now, in order to simplify things, all of the breakpoints I'm about to show you have been rounded up to the nearest factor of 10 and assume that buffs such as Focus Spirit and Enhanced Power each provide exactly 10% power. So as an example, if a certain breakpoint required 26.5% power versus, it's listed as 30 because you still need 3 different properties or talents in order to reach the threshold to hit the breakpoint. Now we're gonna start out with Legend and move on to Kata. And I've categorized the breakpoints in 3 different categories: the crucial breakpoints, the significant breakpoints, and the hard to reach breakpoints. Now, one crucial thing to remember is that raw power buffs such as Enhanced Power affects every category equally at the same time, effectively reducing the amount of power you need to hit every breakpoint by 10% all at once. Which means with Enhanced Power you would only need 10% power versus Skaven on the charm and another 10% power versus Skaven on the bow itself to hit both the crucial and the significant breakpoint. Now if you didn't catch all of them, don't worry, we're gonna recap on them shortly, but for now we're gonna move on to the breakpoints for Cataclysm difficulty, which are slightly more convoluted. Now just to be clear, 1SBS stands for one shot body shot, 1SHS stands for one shot headshot, and BS plus LS stands for body shot plus light shot, meaning first you do a fully charged attack and then you simply spam the left mouse button for your second attack to perform a light shot. And as a general rule of thumb, I would recommend that any player playing on Cataclysm difficulty should at the very least hit the one-shot body shot breakpoint for assassins, regardless of whether you're playing on the Handmaiden or any other Carillion character. And in an attempt to hopefully move all of this knowledge from your working memory and into your visual memory, let's just do a quick demonstration / recap on all of the significant breakpoints. Starting out with Legend, we got the 20% Skaven Infantry for a one-shot body shot assassin, 30% for a one-shot body shot strangler, 20% for a one-shot body shot versus either gunners or flame rats, 50% to one-shot body shot a gas rat, and another 50% to one-shot body shot a blightstormer or a leech. And lastly, we got all of the Cataclysm breakpoints, starting off with the most crucial, which is the 30% versus Skaven and Infantry in order to one-shot body shot an assassin, which again I have to stress is an absolutely crucial breakpoint. Next up, we got the 20% power versus chaos and armored in order to one-shot headshot a 𝒮𝔮𝔲𝔢𝔯𝒮𝒮𝔮𝔢𝔮𝔮𝒮𝒮𝒮𝒮𝒮𝒮𝒮𝒮𝒮𝒮𝒮😊 which is most certainly one of the better breakpoints. And then we got 20% chaos infantry in order to body shot and light shot a blightstormer or a leech, 30% skaven and monster for the same thing on a strangler, 20% skaven infantry for the same thing on a gas rat, and 30% skaven armored in order to two-shot body shot a storm vermin. And lastly, we have 50% required versus skaven armored in order to one-shot body shot a gunner or a flamer. Now, one of the most important jobs you have as a support is killing specials. Now I know what you might be thinking. Plenty of heroes kill specials. Plenty of heroes focus on killing specials. And what the hell has that even got to do with being a support? Well, let me tell you. Imagine that you just jumped down a point of no return. It could be Athalie and Louis, Empire and Flames, it doesn't really matter. But what does is that you're immediately ambushed and surrounded, which is fairly common and not a problem in of itself. But now also imagine in the next moment, whilst everyone is occupied with not dying, somewhere in the far distance, almost too far away to attack, a blightstormer is starting to cast his whirlwind, which is going to trap you and your team, potentially wiping the entire game. It is your job to kill that which others cannot reach. So when a strangler grabs the dwarf and pulls him straight into a wall of enemies, you might want to consider resisting the urge of bursting into laughter. Because joke's on you, you're going with him. So when you spot a gas rat wreaking havoc from the wrong side of half a horde and 3/4 of a patrol, well, best of luck to you, cause you're gonna go fuck it up. Or you know, die trying, potentially. And sure, I am over exaggerating slightly in order to illustrate the point, but you get what I'm trying to say. If there is something, anything, threatening literally the whole team, and your first thought is, God damn it, I can't reach it, because you're afraid of dying, then you just have to know that you are potentially dooming your entire team. Because if you can't reach it, sure as hell, no one else can either. Now, I just want to take a minute or two to talk about how to effectively deal with disablers using the longbow, or at the very least a couple of tips to help you do so. Now, the first rookie mistake people make is to try and shoot the disabler the moment they spot it. And it's not that there's anything inherently wrong with that, assuming you hit the shot, but it's neither the safest nor most consistent approach in most cases. Now, the first tip is to always prepare both the shot and the dodge, so that just in case either one fails, hopefully the other doesn't. In other words, don't trust yourself to hit even an easy shot, because sometimes you won't. And therein lies a key point to an efficient use of the longbow. You see, it's all about making your shots count. Take your time, take your aim, choose your window, and nail the shot. Now, this was unfortunately the only clip I could find in my archives showcasing what I'm talking about, but notice how I'm synchronizing my shot with my dodge. There was a window in which I could have chosen to take the shot first, but if you do that and miss or just don't kill the strangler for whatever reason, your brain suddenly has to react to the fact that you missed the shot, and it's thus unprepared. Whereas if you synchronize the two and assume from the beginning that you're gonna do both regardless, you're less likely to find yourself in a reactionary scenario. Now, the exact same thing is true for assassins. Let's say I just cannot hit the shot, right? Well, I should have already decided that I was going to dodge way before I knew I fucked up, because you never know when you're going to fuck up. Because if you did, you wouldn't fuck up. Now, whenever you're trying to snipe an assassin, you really want to consider your window. Now, this also applies to stranglers, but it's especially crucial when you're trying to hit an assassin. And try to see if you can spot what all these assassin kills have in common. Because even if your aim is as solid as Symbols, the world's best Counter-Strike player, if your window is bad, you're going to miss, because a bow, oddly enough, has projectile travel time, and assassins will often move in completely unpredictable and irrational patterns of 90 and 180 degree turns, moving back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and up and down, switching aggro, despawning, respawning, before suddenly insta-locking on your face like a heat-seeking missile in less than a second and buries you in front of your friends. And the problem is, if you miss your one shot due to a directional change from the assassin, and it chooses to pouch at you in the next moment, then you're essentially relying on the unreliable of reacting with a flick shot in a fraction of a second and hitting the assassin mid-air, when really you should just make your first shot count. And the most consistent way to do that is to wait for the moment the assassin freezes right before it's going to jump, because the assassin is unable to change direction while it's locking in its pouch. And if you still miss the shot, you're already ready with your dodge. Get wrecked, motherfucker! And to some extent it's the same story with leeches. It's about taking your time and making the shot count. If you just rush, turn, shoot and don't get the headshot, chances are you're just gonna have to deal with him again momentarily, and it might be at a less opportune moment where you're unable to shoot him. And the time window you have between hearing the teleport and the leech grabbing you is always the same. So if you want to be consistent about it and there's room for you to do it, I can warmly recommend challenging yourself by always waiting for the last second before taking the shot and then synchronizing it with your dodge in similar fashion to the example with the Strangler. So to recap, with the longbow it's almost universally a better idea to take your time and hit the shot rather than having to shoot twice. And if you don't have the room to take out the special, take full advantage of the 2-second window of invisibility you have when using your career ability, and try the best you can to go out of your way to remove annoyingly placed special minions. And lastly, before we move on, watch this guy, watch this, watch this, watch this. And you see that? You see that? You see it? Look, look. The swap. It was amazing. Like, that's 10 out of 10 style points right there. But anyways, let's move on to part 5. And that's attack sequences. Now, for those of you who already watched my Carillion Melee Mastery Mechanics guide, will likely be aware of most of the things we're gonna cover in this segment as we go through the crucial attack sequences for the most important weapons. Starting off with the Sword and Dagger and its basic infantry combo, which is a double light attack followed by a block cancel, at which point you repeat the sequence. Now, for those of you who aren't really comfortable with the mechanics of block canceling, do have another option, since you can always default into a heavy attack followed by a light attack and then repeat that sequence. And as for armored minions, it's extremely important that you get into the habit of using the push block attack into a heavy rather than doing a double heavy attack, for reasons that are admittedly kind of hard to quantify in words, but it has to do with your ability to have a continuous attack flow whilst you're dodging around the enemy minions, and it allows for a much safer playstyle and damage dealing versus multiple elites. Up next, we got the Spear and Shield, and this part is particularly important if you want to utilize one of the best builds in the game. Now, the thing about the Spear and Shield is it's not particularly great at dealing with infantry minions, and it has 3 different combos for dealing with infantry minions that you need to use at the right time. A push into a heavy and then repeating the sequence is what you want to be doing versus extremely high minion densities, whilst your second combo, which is a heavy attack followed by a block cancel and repeated to infinity, is the attack you want to use whenever you have the space to continuously move back and forth, and is the most effective damage and cleave wise, but that combo is way too slow if you have stuff all around you, or even just individual trash minions that are scattered in all directions. For these cases, you want to be using a heavy attack into a double light attack and repeating that sequence. And don't forget to keep in mind that it's only the second of the 2 light attacks that has any significant cleave. And as for armored minions, you're simply gonna be using the exact same combo that we did on the Sword and Dagger, which is a push block attack into a heavy attack, and then repeating the sequence. Or alternatively, if the target has low HP, you can always add the next heavy attack to the sequence in order to quickly finish off the enemy minion. Now we're just gonna cover the next 3 weapons super quickly, but for the spear versus infantry minions, you wanna do a push block attack into a double light attack and then repeating the sequence. Whereas versus armored minions, you wanna do a light attack into a heavy attack for an effective double stab combo that's easy getting headshots with. And with Carillion's two-handed sword, you wanna initiate versus infantry minions with a push block attack and follow it up by a double light attack, and repeat that sequence until you get a critical hit, at which point you can just spam your light attack. Whilst versus armored minions, you wanna do a heavy attack into a block cancel and repeating that sequence. Now this is especially important for this sequence since it increases your attack speed quite significantly. And alternatively, versus a mixed pool of enemies, you can do a heavy attack into a light attack, which, as I mentioned in a previous video, will then in fact be your second heavy attack. And last up we got the glaive, where versus infantry minions you wanna be doing a double light attack into a block cancel and then repeating that sequence for a slight boost to your attack speed, although you can alternatively, if you're not comfortable with block cancelling, simply finish out the entire sequence. And of course versus armored minions, it's a simple heavy attack into a light attack, which will in fact, like with the sword, perform a double heavy attack. Now whilst on the topic of melee, I thought I'd just answer a brief question unrelated to the Handmaiden's specifically. Now in my first top 10 tips video, I was originally gonna talk about attack speed for number 10, and had a fully finished script written that there's a plus 50% cap on attack speed bonuses. Now normally I don't write my scripts before I do testing, but I was absolutely sure at the time that this was the case because I had researched it for a prior video about a year ago. But when I started doing my recordings that were supposed to illustrate what I had written in my script, I very quickly realized that something was up and that this was no longer the case, despite the fact that a Google search for attack speed cap Vermintide will still give you the result of 50%. And at first I thought maybe the attack speed cap wasn't present when using a speed pot. But just watch these two examples here, neither of which are using speed pots with 55% and 80% attack speed bonuses. Quite clearly, the 80% on the right side was significantly faster than the 55% on the left side, and assuming there is a cap, I haven't yet been able to find it. So for the sake of argument, if we exclude the absolute most extreme end of the spectrum, there is effectively no attack speed cap. Anyways, I just thought I would share those results with you guys. And now we're finally ready to move on to our first builds, which I have named Perfectly Balanced, Melee and Ranged. You guys see that? You saw my lightning? Only took me 6 minutes of standing still waiting for the right moment. But anyways, Perfectly Balanced are your go-to quick play builds with the sword and dagger. Whee! And they are very similar, although they do vary in a couple of ways. But let's start out by looking at their item properties. Now, both of these builds run crit chance, block cost reduction and swift slaying on the weapon itself. Whereas on the longbow, you got Skaven and infantry on the melee version and armored and Skaven on the ranged version. And I'll get to why a bit later in this segment. Now, both of the builds are using stamina, health and bark skin on the necklace, but Boon of 𝒮𝔢𝔢𝔯𝒮𝔮𝔲𝔞𝔡 and block cost reduction are also viable options. On the charm, they are both using attack speed, power versus Skaven and decanter in order to hit the most crucial ranged breakpoints. As for the trinket, I've given them both crit chance, stamina recovery and explosive ordnance, but the properties themselves here are meant for cataclysm difficulty, and really you can vary any of these 4 properties as you see fit, although I would suggest that anyone who's planning to pick up grimoires should be using curse resistance in combination with one of the other 3 properties. Now as for the talents, they're both using Spirit Echo, Asri Alacrity and Gift of Ladriel, and those 3 talents should not be changed. Now the melee version is using Willow Stance, while the ranged version is using Wraithwalk, but really you can juggle these 2 talents around any way you see fit, and the same goes for Birch Stance, which I've put on the melee version, and Quiver of Plenty, which I've put on the ranged version, but again these 2 talents are a matter of preference, unlike Mainstay, which I've put on the melee version, and Enhanced Power, which I've put on the ranged version, that are connected to the power versus properties I've put on the longbow in order to hit the most efficient breakpoints. In other words, the 4 things you can vary as you see fit are the 2 options for the level 20 talent, the 2 options for the level 25 talent, as well as both properties on the trinket and the non-health property on the necklace. Now, as for how you should select those 2 talents of the 4 options, the case is pretty straightforward for level 25. Do you want more arrows to shoot more specials, or are you dying a lot and do you need more block cost reduction? Now, as for the level 20 talent, using Willow Stance obviously sounds great to get those sweet green circles, but especially if you're a newer player, let me show you why I think Wraithwalk would be the right choice. Now, admittedly, I might be biased here because it is one of my favorite talents, but it really does add an extra dimension to your survivability, especially in those moments when your career ability is on cooldown, and it means you don't have to worry, although you should, about where you end up in terms of your career ability, because with the talent Wraithwalk, there is no such thing as getting completely stuck. No matter how many minions surround you, there's always a way out, which makes this talent particularly useful for, as I said earlier, clutching the shit out of any situation. Oh, and in case I haven't forgotten, I have linked all of the 8 builds down in the comment section below, and in case I have forgotten, please someone remind my future self down in the comment section below. And if you're still unsure which of the 2 builds to use, the case for the melee version is obviously that it's better at dealing with hordes, it deals slightly more armor damage with heavy attacks, and just generally speaking you have a higher attack speed, but it does come at a cost, especially on Cataclysm difficulty. You see, with the melee version, you're only able to hit 1.5 of the significant breakpoints. Yes, I said 1.5. Now, the assassin is the 1, and the Storm Vermin is the half. You see, it is in fact possible to 2-shot body shot a Storm Vermin with only 20% power versus armored and Skaven, but only if the first attack puts him into Stagger 2 and the second attack hits while he's in Stagger 2, which to be fair is not very reliable, and also you don't hit the one-shot headshot breakpoint on 𝒮𝔮𝔢𝔯𝒮𝔮𝔲𝔞𝔤𝔄 which is quite significant, whereas the ranged version hits both the one-shot body shot assassin, the body shot plus light shot strangler, the body shot plus light shot gas-rat, the 2-shot body shot storm vermin, and finally the 1-shot headshot on a 𝒮𝔮𝔢𝔮𝔮𝔄𝒮. In other words, for the purpose of special killing, the ranged version is superior. But you know, we all enjoy hack and slashing once in a while, and there ain't nothing wrong with that. Anyways, let's move on to the Iron Maiden. Easy and hard. No guys, not that kind of hard, you fucking perverts. Did you guys see that? You see my lightning? Oh wait, did I make that joke already? I want to say I have the memory of a goldfish, but I don't quite remember if I do. Anyways, what I do remember is that the Iron Maiden Easy and Hard are your go-to tryhard builds for doing really difficult stuff. They're both using Spear and Shield with attack speed, block cost reduction, and importantly, Opportunist. And we'll get to why momentarily. Now, on the Longbow, they're also both using Power versus Skaven and Power versus Armored, and of course, Conservative Shooter. They're also both using 20% health, 30% block cost reduction in combination with Barkskin. And as for the charm, they're also both using attack speed, Power versus Skaven, and Decanter. And as for the trinket, I would suggest that anyone who doesn't feel extremely comfortable with use movement speed for the extra mobility, but really it's a similar scenario to the perfectly balanced builds, and you can really vary the same 4 properties as you see fit. Now both of these builds are using Martial Blessing, Enhanced Power, Wraith Walk, and Gift of Ladriel. Although Willow Stance is also optional here. Now the place they vary is Azrai Alacrity and Focus Spirit, as well as Quiver of Plenty and Birch Stance. And I would recommend that anyone who isn't a seasoned Handmaiden player use the easy version, since the buff from Focus Spirit is depending on not taking damage for a full 10 seconds. But as is so often the case, this risk also comes with significant rewards. As you may remember earlier, we talked about all of the Longbow's significant breakpoints for Cataclysm difficulty. You guys see my lightning? Okay, it's not funny anymore, I'll stop, I promise. But here's the thing, it's a hard build to master, but if you can master it, you hit every single significant breakpoint the Longbow has at the same time. Now, this is of course only true while the buff is active, but even when it's not active, you're still able to hit the most important ones like the one-shot body shot assassin and the one-shot headshot 𝒮𝔮𝔢𝔮𝔮𝔢𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮𝔮 definition of perfectly balanced. But what truly sets the Iron Maiden builds apart from perfectly balanced is something else entirely, and that's stagger breakpoints. Now for those of you who would like to know the exact stagger breakpoints for every single minion with every single attack, I have referenced the exact same guide that I used in my top 10 tips video, the weapon edition, down in the description below. Because it would simply take way too long to go through every single potential stagger breakpoint in either build versus every elite minion doing either one of its attacks. I have however collected the most important ones that are functional in both builds for you here. Now the hardest attack to stagger in both Berserkers and Monks is their chain attack. And for monks, you need your push in order to stagger them in that state, which is equivalent to saying that your push is always going to stagger a monk. And the exact same is true for a savage berserker. Except for a berserker, your third light attack can also stagger its chain attack, with both the easy and the hard build, whereas only the hard version is capable of doing it with the spear and shield's second heavy attack. And versus Storm Vermins, both pushing and your heavy attack sequence is all capable of cancelling all Storm Vermin's attacks, including their heavy attacks, which is extremely useful when you're fighting a patrol. And the exact same is true for Maulers. Both pushing and your heavy attack sequence are both capable of cancelling all Maulers' attacks, and so the story continues for Beastigores and Wargores, aka Banners, or Flag Beastigores, or whatever the fuck you want to call them. They're extremely annoying and they like to plant their flag everywhere. Wait a second. They're Americans! Just kidding. A quarter of my viewers are Americans. Please don't hate me. It was a joke, I promise. Jokes aside though, it's both your pushing and your heavy attacks that can cancel all of their attacks, including when they're charging you, which admittedly feels extremely satisfying. And then we got Chaos Warriors. Now versus Chaos Warriors, you can only cancel their light attacks with either your push or your heavy attack, but it still allows you to do extremely funny trolls such as this. That is until you realize that was a heavy attack and they smack your face. It is however still extremely useful when fighting multiple Chaos Warriors. Now last thing before we move on is kind of unrelated, but I simply have to show you guys cause one of these Chaos Warriors pulled an insane fucking ninja move on me that I admittedly did not see coming, and I thought it would be funny for you guys to see if you can spot him before he wrecks me. And time's up. Okay, admittedly that was kinda unfair. But seriously though, talk about an unlucky freaking angle. But enough about me getting outsmarted by something dumber than Botvar. Let's move on to part 8. Berserker Maiden and ThePartyKnives. As well as 2 other builds, but they didn't deserve their own category. Now, due to video length and also somewhat viability, we are gonna skip fairly quickly over these last 4 builds. Although I do think that this first one deserves a little bit more attention than the other 3. Now, if I'm being honest, this build is probably most functional on Legend difficulty, but it can work on Cataclysm as well as in this scenario. Now, just to be clear, this is a risky build. But the idea behind it is that you use your dash in order to get a bunch of critical hit chance, and then you take out your swift bow and spam a bunch of light attacks in order to proc the trait Hunter, giving you 25% extra power versus a given specific armor class. And due to the extra critical hit chance, you're fairly likely to proc swift slaying in the process, since you also have an extra 15% attack speed from the talent Willow Stance. And when you combine these 3 factors, you have one hell of a hard-hitting Handmaiden with no small amount of attack speed. Now, in the clip I'm about to use, I have the wrong talent on my ultimate, or the right one, depending on how you look at it. But starting with the item properties, it's a pretty straightforward crit chance attack speed swift slaying, followed by a crit chance power versus infantry and a hunter, standard properties on the necklace, power versus chaos and attack speed on the charm, and crit chance stamina recovery on the trinket, since you know, if you're gonna use this build, you might as well go all in. And only a pussy would use curse resistance on the Berserker Maiden. I mean, come on, that's not very Berserker-ish. Anyways, it's important that you remember to push a lot due to Azrai Alacrity, which gives you another 30% attack speed as well as 10% extra power. And if you really want to hit the jackpot and go full retard to the extent that Slayer will look at you and think, God damn, then you also need power from pain. And I mean, at this point you might as well, you're already in balls deep. And sure, you can mock the viability of this build all you like, but it is goddamn motherfucking satisfying. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a fact. But you know what's also a fact? The fact that ThePartyKnives is obviously the dual daggers. And I'd be willing to bet you never seen daggers this beautiful before. Eh? I mean, just look at those red, beautiful, shining blades of death. You really can't hate on the dual daggers. Even if you know the sword and dagger are theoretically better, you just cannot hate on the dual daggers. I mean, they're like a timeless classic that just never gets old. And due to their high mobility and extremely simple attack sequences, they're really great for newer players. And although you can also build them with the longbow, I've chosen to go with the Handmaiden shortbow for the sake of variety, and also because you need something to clear trash minions with. Now, one alternative to using the Handmaiden shortbow if you're not comfortable with it could be the talent for your career ability called Blade Dancer, although I'm not a huge fan of it. You can also just ignore it altogether, since it is entirely possible with good dodges to deal with semi-dense hordes of infantry minions as long as you have room to dodge in, which if you're using Wraithwalk, you pretty much always have. Now, as for the 2 last builds, I'm not gonna go into details on the properties or talents, but I've linked both of them down in a pinned comment along with all of the other builds. But essentially this build is called the Sword of Forward Momentum, and it's a slightly off-meta speedrunning build that's really great for practicing block cancelling. And lastly, there's the Medic Maiden, which I named it in a perhaps slightly too creative attempt at having a theme for each build, even going as far as deciding to put revive speed on the trinket before realizing I had lost my mind and changing it back to something that actually worked. But it's essentially a highly mobile spear build, and it's sort of reminiscent of a speedrunning build that has been modified to better fit the realm of quick playing. And lastly, before we move on, I just thought I'd mention that none of these builds are set in stone, and it is my hope that I've done enough for you guys to see an emerging pattern in terms of what makes sense and what you can change without ruining the breakpoints while still modifying the build to fit your requirements. And lastly, before we get to the part you've likely all been waiting for, about how to become a level 5 Grandmaster Clutch Wizard, we first have to get a couple of things straight in part 9. Which is all about how to keep you and your team alive for as long as possible. Now, if you remember in the beginning of this video, one of the first things I said was that keeping your teammates alive should be your first, second and third priority, and one of the absolute key aspects to doing that successfully comes down to positioning. Now, I way too often see Handmaiden players being the first one to arrive and the first one to leave. And this is a huge mistake for two reasons. First of all, your team's survival might very well depend on having your stamina regeneration on, and saving people from disablers is what you would call a time-sensitive issue. So to the extent that it's possible, you want to try your best to never be more than a single career ability away from your entire team. And I want to just clarify something I said in yesterday's video, not a Handmaiden guide, about selfish plays being justified because you were more likely to resurrect your team than the other way around. But that only applies once everything has gone to shit and you've tried as unselfishly as you possibly could to save every single person on the team. Like shown in this clip where I pretty haphazardly charged after my grabbed teammate with my Handmaiden shortbow out in an attempt to do anything I possibly could to release him from the strangler, even though it wasn't a scenario that was in any way safe or comfortable for myself either. And just to be clear, this is not some moral statement about, wow, I must be a great guy. I mean, I totally am though, but that's a whole different argument. This is about you playing the Handmaiden. And when you're on the Handmaiden, you have to be willing to sacrifice yourself, or at the very least risk sacrificing yourself in order to save your teammates. Because even if you get stuck in a Cataclysm 3 Chaos Patrol, there's always a way out when you're playing on the Handmaiden. And of course some scenarios are unsavable and shouldn't be attempted, but ask yourself first, was that save undoable or were you just unwilling to do it? Now lastly, before we move on, any and all Handmaiden players should be aware of and comfortable with these 3 uses of your career ability, starting off with resurrecting while you're using your career ability, and if you can, try to make as much space for them afterwards as possible. And it's also important that you trust your 2-second invisible enough that you can use your career ability even next to enemy minions, equip and apply a medkit before moving on. And with a bit of coordination and or timing, this also extends to use on your teammates. And really the two only hard parts about this is getting the initial right click and having the confidence to pull all the way through, knowing that it's absolutely safe. And finally, we're ready to move on to the part you've all been waiting for, le grand finale, and part 10, the Handmaiden Philosophy. And in case you're super confused about that man on the screen, clearly you don't play Counter-Strike, cause that's the Danish Astralis player 𝒮𝔞𝔤𝔢𝔯𝔞𝔡, whom the internet crowned the Clutch Minister. Now, truth be told, there isn't a video long enough for me to possibly tell you everything you need to know about playing the Handmaiden. On one side, you have it easier than anyone else due to your survival capabilities, but at the same time, you quite often also have the hardest job to do. Now, whilst the seasoned Handmaiden player might find it inherently easy to stay alive even in dire circumstances, as I quite often do myself, it's always at the expense of putting in work and having constant focus and attention. The way I like to see it, as a Handmaiden, you've kind of been giving the tools for immortality, but only to the extent that you make perfect decisions. And even slacking for a moment or trying to take the easy way will quite often cost you your life. And whilst it might look, feel and be much easier to survive on the Handmaiden than pretty much any other class, I quite often find that the pressure is also a lot higher, because sometimes with another class you simply get overwhelmed and you're like, oh shit, there's nothing I can do. But when you're playing the Handmaiden, you know that there's always something you can do. Your survival is entirely in your own hands and no one else's. It doesn't matter how screwed the situation is, you can always survive a little longer on the Handmaiden. And there's most certainly a pressure associated with knowing that it's never okay to throw in the towel. And playing her well requires much more than just a fair bit of mechanical skill. Really, honestly, that's the easy part. The hard part is first of all about developing your game IQ so you can make the right decisions. And harder yet, developing a calmness, focus and peace of mind during the middle of a shit show to even have the mental capacity to start thinking about what you're going to do next, let alone developing a plan about what you're going to do in 10, 20, 30 or even 60 seconds. What are you going to do if a strangler spawns right now? What are you going to do if an assassin spawns right now? That plan should already be formulated in your head before the special minion even spawns. But really the truth is that most clutches, regardless of whether or not you're playing the Handmaiden, like the one shown here, didn't require incredible mechanical skill. It essentially only required one single thing, and that was not screwing up a series of fairly simple steps that I bet nearly every Legend player could have pulled off mechanically if you removed the pressure of being the last man standing and the win depending on just whether or not you survived. Most people kill themselves in a clutch, way before that disabler they're scared shitless of even gets to them through panic and the subsequent poor decision making. And I really mean it when I'm saying that 2 out of 3 clutches can be pulled off simply by not screwing up monumentally. So what about the last third? What do you do when you're solo and the game throws a curveball at you like a double assassin or even just an assassin and a strangler? Well, of course you can't win them all, and once in a while you are gonna get unlucky and simply just get wrecked. But I bet even half of that last third were potentially winnable if not for the fact that you did a monumental screw up. Now to be fair, that's not really your fault, or anyone else's for that matter. It comes down to the way the human brain's fight or flight response works. And it essentially comes down to what your brain does when it's presented with more threats than it can juggle and keep track of in its head. And that's a common domain for major unnecessary screw-ups to happen. But there is something you can do to prevent it or at the very least minimize it. Now let's say you're the last man standing and you're running for your life with an army behind you, and you hear both an assassin and a strangler spawn at the same time. Now in my experience, one of two things are likely to happen. In an attempt to keep track of both disablers, you end up either going the wrong way, trapping yourself, or simply just getting hit by normal enemy minions, either of which should be the most basic of the tasks at hand. Or, in an attempt at keeping track of all things at once, you instead end up losing track of both disablers and get hit by one that you could have easily dodged if you had kept your focus in one place. So in an attempt to keep track of everything, you lose track of what's going on right in front of you. So whenever you're in a situation where you feel it's out of your hands, it's out of your league, you're not comfortable and you're in too deep, it's universally a better idea to keep your focus on what you can control and ignore everything you can't control. So if you're running from a dense army of minions in your back, a strangler is coming from your front, and you then hear an assassin coming from your back as well, chances are you're not going to be able to take out an assassin that's jumping from a horde of minions anyways. So it would be really stupid to get grabbed by that strangler that you have vision on, that you can see, and that you clearly have the capabilities of dodging, simply because you were too worried about that assassin that you couldn't do anything about anyways. So for the time being, the assassin doesn't exist. And once you've dealt with the strangler, you can worry about getting around the next corner as quickly as possible and hope to catch the assassin in an off angle. So in order to play a great Handmaiden, you sometimes need to be bold and have the balls to attempt what only a true mad lad would ever dream about attempting on any other class, like this true solo no hot engines of war event. But at the same time, after you equipped your sunglasses and jumped headfirst into a metaphorical erupting volcano, your mind has to stay completely calm like the wind while you are doing absolutely mad lad things. Because the difference between playing a good and a great Handmaiden is all about decision making and having restraint, especially regarding when to, and more importantly, when not to, use your career ability. You have to plan 3 steps ahead if you want to get all these barrels to their location. And you really shouldn't worry about failing, because on the Handmaiden you can always just do another dodge circle and try again once your career ability is off cooldown. So in any solo situation as the Handmaiden, if you're unsure whether or not it's a good idea, then it's probably worth it at least considering doing one more round and hoping for a better positioning or a better window. But to be fair, that's easier said than done, especially if you haven't practiced true solo before, which by the way is something I would recommend that any player with 200 plus hours played who really wants to improve as much as possible in as little time as possible, and not necessarily just at playing Handmaiden but at the game in general, should try to grab a Handmaiden, queue up a solo legend on Fort Braxenbrücke, tell yourself that you're gonna try at least 5 or perhaps even 10 times in a row regardless of the outcome, completely ignore the existence of the bots, grab a pair of dual daggers and put movement speed on your trinket, make sure you light attack in order to gain attack speed, and forget all thoughts about winning or losing, cause that's not what this is about. And those thoughts will only distract you. So for at least an hour or two, your single only goal should be to fight for every single second you can stay alive. Get as far as you can, survive for as long as you can. It doesn't matter where you end up, it doesn't matter how you end up there, but just having that experience for an hour or two where you're under way more pressure than you can handle, but without the actual pressure, since it's only you and there's no goal. That is, other than fighting for every single meter, every single second, for as long as you can, and at no point in those runs should you think, goddammit, it's over now. Instead, what you should do is have a rough sketch in your head of the route you're going to take, that you can then add on or change from game to game. But before you start running, you always have a plan A. That's the plan you're gonna follow, assuming everything goes perfectly and you run into absolutely no trouble, which obviously won't be the case, because on Fort Braxtonberger sometimes one route is open, sometimes the other route is open, which means it's going to force you to think about how you're going to deviate from your original plan when things don't go accordingly. And you don't have to worry about, oh my god, I'm going the wrong direction now. It doesn't matter. If you had to drop down and that was backwards, then you had to drop down and that was backwards. And it really doesn't matter if you get 20 meters or 200 meters. It really doesn't. All that matters is that you got as far as you possibly could that run. And do yourself a favor afterwards and queue at least one quick play on whatever is your go-to difficulty. And although I obviously can't promise you that it'll have the same effect on you as it did on me, I'd be willing to bet that most of you, if you've been doing that for 2 hours straight, will very quickly realize that you suddenly feel extremely calm in situations that would usually stress you out. Because think about it, you just had an entire legend map up your ass for 2 hours straight, with no one to help you, no one to count on, only you to survive. And suddenly pulling a chaos patrol seems like peanuts. You had the equivalent of 3 patrols and an assassin and a boss and a gunner and a strangler all at the same time. And right now you even have 2 buddies to help you. And sure, it's also great for your mechanical skill, but really what I'm hoping that you'll achieve is the ability to feel calm mid-combat, and hopefully enough so that whilst everyone else is focused on what's right in front of them and not dying, you still have the extra mental capacity to see the bigger picture and actually wonder about how everyone else is doing while you're fighting for your own life. Because that will allow you to assess who needs your help the most. Maybe someone is trapped and needs you to help them make space in order to get out. Maybe someone is low HP and needs you to heal them with a medkit, or even just pass them a potion. And if you're ever in a clutch scenario, one more thing is that you should never use your career ability without first considering how you're going to survive the next 18 seconds while it's on cooldown. And before we get to the last bit, enjoy me getting completely fucking owned because of a goddamn motherfucking wargore that pushed me into a whirlwind. And yes, we lost the game right after. But that's besides the point. It was a worthy attempt. Maybe next time I'll learn to watch my fucking ass before standing next to a Blightstormer when being approached by a wargore. Yes, that was the moral of that story. But lastly, if you really wanna be el clutchy presidente, you have to get creative about how you're gonna get past an objective. And so in order to finish this video off, I actually downloaded the 11th video I ever uploaded to YouTube. Back when most of my videos consisted of me doing a speedrun of someone else's double emperor deed. Hey, it was a great way to get loot. Anyways, these were the modifiers and I had to get creative for the end event, as you can probably imagine. Now I am gonna speed parts of the clip up in order to hopefully not bore you to death, but I really thought this was worth featuring, just to show you guys that you have to get creative sometimes and that there's no such thing as an unwinnable scenario for a handmaiden, and it all really just comes down to your degree of failure, because just like a honey badger, handmaiden doesn't give a fuck. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why I love the Handmaiden. She's a team hero, she's a support, she's mobile, great at killing specials, but most of all, when shit hits the fan and you're the last person standing, you always have a say in whether or not this is going to be a victory. You know the old saying, it's never over until the fat lady sings? Well, the way I see it, it's never over while this lumberfoot is still standing. Hey, what up guys, 𝒮𝔬𝔢𝔢 here. Now, that was a behemoth of a video. Woo! Not gonna lie, that took a while to make. Now, I know what you guys might be thinking. 𝒮𝔬𝔢𝔢, are you wearing a red t-shirt with a red shirt on top? Only a mad lad would wear red on top of red. Like, what? I know, right? Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hopefully you learned something new. It really took me ages to make. Like, it's only like 5 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday when I'm starting the render. So it was like the more time I had, the more stuff I just kept adding. So, and I apologize if it got a little bit preachy in the end, but I truly do believe, because I remember just how big of a difference it made to me as a player the first time I true soloed. Just this sense of calm when shit went down. I was like, oh, I felt the same, because a moment ago, like in the previous game, I had literally been running for my life straight for 20 minutes, and so suddenly pulling a chaos patrol or like stuff going sideways was nothing compared to what I had just, you know, like there was no more panic left, because my panic had been at full, like it had been throttled at maximum for the past 20 minutes, and so I could think suddenly while fighting for my life, if that makes sense. Like that's I can't promise that it's gonna work for you guys the same way it did for me, but I just know that it really gave me extra capacity to make good decisions in game, simply because you weren't constantly focused on, you know what I mean? That's never an optimal state to be in. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and as always, I love you guys. Stay awesome. Peace out.